We're now in one of the most important seasons for Waka, autumn, and so I thought it might be helpful to say a few things about the types of topics and subjects that poems on this season tend to address. Broadly speaking, and this I think applies to all the seasonal Waka, we could divide the topics into a number of overarching categories, those being the season, celestial objects and phenomena, topography, life, ceremonies, animals, and plants. Now, not all of these categories were equally important or generated the same number of poems, but at least there will be some waka falling into these areas for all the seasons, autumn included. It's also the case that these categories weren't exclusive, and so you'll frequently get, for example, a poem on the season which makes use of a reference to a plant and the weather. Finally, it's also the case that some of these categories were more or less popular at different points in Waka history, and the same is true of specific subtopics and associated diction which make them up. Again, as a very broad generalisation, we see a wide range of topics and acceptable poetic diction in the earliest periods of Waka history, the 7th and 8th centuries. But these were then narrowed down in the mid-10th to produce a canon, if you will, that was both reflective of and acceptable to the court nobility dwelling in Heian Kyo. Over the following centuries, other topics and diction began to creep in, and after Waka gave rise to linked verse and then haikai, and the social background of poets expanded from court aristocrats to samurai and educated commoners, there was a proliferation of seasonal topics and diction, reflecting the much more varied social background of the people who were now composing poetry. My focus here is Waka though, so I'm going to limit myself to talking about the types of topics you'd find in that genre of poetry, with the proviso, again, that you won't necessarily find all of these all the time. So, what were the most important autumn seasonal topics? Well, first of all, there was the chronology of autumn, the progression through the season from its beginning, when it might be largely indistinguishable from late summer, to its end, when it shaded into winter. The beginning of autumn was marked by hints that the oppressive summer heat was lifting, with breezes turning suddenly cooler. Gradually, this cold would intensify until by the end of autumn, poets would really be feeling the chill as winter arrived. Linked with this progression was a further subtopic of regrets or puzzlement that the season, as manifested in the weather, wasn't matching up to the season as recorded by the calendar. The mismatch between nature and human constructions, in other words. The most common type of topic of this type was lingering heat, zansho. Poems protesting that although the 7th month of the year had arrived, summer's heat had not yet lifted. Why the 7th month, you may ask? Well, pre-modern Japan operated on the lunar calendar, which allowed 3 months to each season. 1 through 3 were spring, 4 through 6 were summer, 7 through 9 were autumn, and 10 through 12 were winter. This calendar didn't always match up with the progression of the Earth around the Sun, and so it wasn't uncommon for the calendrical months not to match the actual season. In fact, the calendar had to be adjusted every so often by inserting an extra intercalary month into it in order to bring it back into balance. So, poets complaining that even though it was officially autumn, the weather and the heat was still like summer was simply a reflection of reality. A good example of a poem on this topic is Aki kitemo nao yu kaze o matsugane ni natsu o wasureshi kage zo tachiyuki. Though the autumn has come, still for an evening breeze must I abide beneath the pines, as I did to forget the summer, loath to leave the shade. Here, the poet complains that, despite the calendrical change of season, the temperature has not altered, and just as in summer, he has to spend his day in the shade of the pine trees to escape the heat. A final, substantial seasonal topic was autumn evenings, both because it was at this time of day that the heat would lift, or coolness would be most keenly felt, and because evening marked the transitional point between day and night, and this fitted with autumn as a boundary between the heat of summer and the cold of winter. Frequently, these poems would use the reference to evening to refer to the end of the season itself. For example, kurete yuku aki no nagori mo yama no ha ni tsuki to tomo ni ya ariake no sora. Turning to dusk, is there a memento of autumn too upon the mountain's edge, together with the moon in the dawning skies? Here, the poet cleverly brings in a mention of dawn, the opposite of dusk, at the end of his poem to create a semantic parallel. The questioning tone creates a dreamlike mood of uncertainty. Is it moonrise or moonset? It's the evening of autumn, but might it also be an autumn evening? The poet isn't sure, and so neither are we. There were a large number of weather or sky-related elements which were considered to be especially connected with autumn. The most important celestial object was undoubtedly the moon, which was felt to be at its fullest and brightest at this time of year. Thus, there are a large number of poems about the moon in autumn, extolling its beauty and brightness, describing the quality of its light, or even complaining that it was obscured by the clouds. These types of poems were often composed at tsukimi, literally seeing the moon, parties, and events which took place at this time of year. It was even the case that the gardens of mansions and palaces were specially constructed in order that the moon could be seen from its best advantage from platforms and locations within them. One can get a sense of the way the moon's light was appreciated, I think, from this poem by the monk Saigyo, when he was composing on the autumn moon. Mukurashiku iori no niwa no yuzu o tama ni motenasu aki no yo no tsuki. Tangled weeds spread around the garden of my hut. Evening dew, a garland of jewels from the moon this autumn night. The autumn moonlight is so bright, Saigyo says, that it makes the dew which has fallen on the tangled thickets of his garden shine like jewels. This emphasises the quality and intensity of the light without saying so directly, making this a masterful piece of suggestion. In terms of weather, there were three phenomena closely associated with autumn: wind, rain, and dew. Autumn winds were felt to bring coolness and blow more strongly than their summer counterparts. This led to a subtopic of gales, nowaki, which dealt with the very strong winds that accompanied the typhoons which struck in mid to late autumn, something which still happens today. Uraburete kasanenu sode wa aki kaze no tatsu ni tsukite zo mono wa kanashiki. Weighed down with sorrow and with no sleeves to pile together, the autumn wind's first gust turns all to sadness. In this poem, the poet, Higo, uses the central idea of the autumn wind to emphasise the melancholy of the season. In common with many autumn poems, she links the ending of the year with the end of a love affair. This is what she means by having no sleeves to pile together, as lovers would take off their outer robes and sleep together beneath them. She doesn't explicitly mention the autumn wind's coldness, but you can feel its chill touch. In the absence of her lover, she feels it, and it only serves to intensify her sadness that their affair is over. The changing temperatures also brought longer and more persistent rain than was the case in summer, as well as lightning, which meant that became a common autumn topic too, as in Memo karezu mamoru yamada no inazuma no hikari ni furete tada narazu miyu. Still fresh to my eyes, the mountain fields I ward by lightning's light are brushed and appear again anew. While autumn is not explicitly mentioned in this poem, the fact that the poet is guarding the fields prior to the harvest is sufficient to identify the season. The link with agriculture is strengthened by the fact that the old Japanese word for lightning was inazuma, which was made up of two elements, ina, meaning rice plant, and tsuma, or in this case zuma, meaning spouse. The word reflects a belief that it was lightning that made the rice germinate, forming a link between the seasonal weather phenomenon, the plant's growth, and the human activity which took place, harvesting their grain. The rain itself could take various forms, and poems often emphasized the way it came and went suddenly, as in Yukue naki aki no omoi zo, sekare nuru, murasame nabiku kumo no chikata. My endless thoughts of autumn have been interrupted by the showers streaming from the far-off clouds. Here, the poet has been dwelling on his melancholy, with autumn clearly being used as a metaphor for something else. Again, probably the end of an affair. But a sudden rain shower breaks his train of thought, although there is also a suggestion that his emotions have got the better of him, and the shower is, in fact, the tears he's shedding in a sudden moment of grief. Finally, the cooler mornings and evenings, when the days were still warm, meant that dewfall was heavier at this time of year, and so poems commenting on how the dewfall changed the appearance of plants and seeds by its presence were not uncommon. Asamadaki, niwa no magaki mo, no waki shite, tsuyu okiagaru, kusa no ha mo nashi. At the cusp of dawn, my garden and my fence too, after the gales, are drenched in dew, flattened blades of grass every one. This poem would officially be one on the topic of gales, nowaki, but Ariie emphasises the persistence of the autumn dew. Even after a storm it falls, and adopts the conceit that it is this weight that has flattened the grass in his garden, rather than the winds which have blown the previous night. Probably the single most important topographical feature associated with autumn was that of autumn rice fields. Autumn was obviously harvest time, and although this wasn't something the nobility were involved with directly, a successful harvest would directly impact on their own wealth due to the agrarian nature of the society. Hence, aristocrats frequently composed what one could almost call rhapsodies about the rice fields in autumn, and, in particular, the feelings of the men set to guard them, with this also feeding into the main autumn topic associated with everyday life, which was about reaping, that is harvesting, rice, for all that this too was an activity with which the nobility would not have had first-hand experience. We saw an example of this type of poem earlier in Toshiyori's poem about lightning, but perhaps the most famous waka on this topic, or certainly the one which is best known today, is by Emperor Tenchi. Aki no ta no, kareho no iyo no, toma o arami, waga koromo de wa tsuyu ni nuretsutsu. In the autumn fields, below the harvest hut's coarse roof of thatch, my sleeves are ever drenched with dew. Perhaps the emperor has been out hunting, and has been caught by the rain, leaving him with no option but to take shelter in the first place he can find, a crude and hastily assembled hut used by peasants during the harvest. It's quite unlike his usual lodgings, allowing the dew to drench his sleeves, although this, too, suggests an undefined melancholy which is making him weep. This poem is still remembered today because it was included in Ogura Hyakunin Isshu, an exemplary collection of poetry which is used for a game called karuta. The game is for 3 players, a reader and 2 competitors. Small cards with the second part of the poems from this collection are laid out on the floor between the competitors, and the reader reads out the first part of each poem in turn. The competitors need to identify and grab the card with the poem in question on it before their opponent, with the winner being the person with the most correct identifications at the end. This game has traditionally been played by families in Japan at New Year, but is also played competitively and is even the subject of a popular manga and anime series, Chihayaburu. In order to succeed, of course, a player needs to have memorized all 100 poems in Ogura Hyakunin Issu, and hence the reason why they are still well known today. There were two major festivals with associated ceremonies in autumn, which were felt to be suitable for commemoration in Waka. The first of these was Tanabata, which took place on the 7th day of the 7th month. This festival marked the annual meeting of the stars Altair and Vega, representing the celestial lovers, the Weaver Maid and the Herd Boy, who, according to legend, had neglected their heavenly duties to such an extent that the Emperor of Heaven punished them by making them live on opposite sides of the great river of heaven, the Milky Way, and only allowing them to meet once a year. This story of fated and eternal love and separation touched the hearts of the Japanese, just as it had those of the Chinese earlier, and so innumerable poems were composed on the topic, frequently with the poet speaking in the voice of one of the two deities. It was customary to make offerings to the Weaver Maid on this day to pray that she would bless women's skill in handicrafts throughout the coming year, so this too became a formal autumn topic. A typical example of an early Tanabata poem is Amanogawa momiji o hashi ni wataseba ya Tanabata tsume no akiyoshi mo matsu. Heaven's river on a bridge of scarlet leaves, can you be crossed? The Weaver Maid eagerly awaits the autumn. The unknown poet cleverly manages to link the ceremonial reference with a further seasonal one, that of autumn leaves, as well as speculating that these could form a bridge by which the lovers could be reunited. The second ceremony was the Chrysanthemum Festival, which took place on the 9th day of the 9th month. Chinese cosmology held that there was an excess of yang energy in the world on that day, and countered it by, among other things, drinking wine flavoured with chrysanthemum petals. In Japan, it became customary to collect the dew from chrysanthemums on this day, as well as present the flowers as gifts and eat various foodstuffs made from them to ward off ill health. All of these activities were accompanied by poems on the subject, making chrysanthemums one of the plants most strongly associated with autumn too. An example of this sort of chrysanthemum-themed poem would be Sakazuki ni ukaberu kyou no kage yori ya utsuroi somuru shiragiku no hana. In my wine cup floating on this day, does the moonlight bring on the changing hues for white chrysanthemum blooms? Ietaka cleverly links the ceremony of the Chrysanthemum Festival with a further seasonal reference to the moon. In fact, in the discussion of this poem in the competition, the opposing team suggests that the poem seems to say that the sake has been whitened by the flower petals in it rather than by the moon's reflection, which they dislike. But the judge, Fujiwara no Shunzei, disagrees, saying it lacks any conspicuous faults. This brings us to the topic of autumn plants. The single most important plant-related topic in Waka was undoubtedly autumn leaves. The word which is used for this in Japanese is momiji, something which now refers explicitly to scarlet maple leaves, but which in earlier periods could refer to a wider range of colour-changing leaves. Poems were composed which admired the look of autumn leaves while they were still upon the trees, while others were also composed about them after they had fallen, and either lay upon the ground or the surface of a water source, like a river. It was an especially common conceit to refer to such layers of leaves as looking like brocade, a rich material which could be used to make outer clothing. The emotions expressed by autumn leaf poems, therefore, spanned the gamut from pleasure and appreciation at their appearance to regret and melancholy that they had fallen. In this way, leaves were the equivalent of cherry or plum blossoms in spring poems. We've already had an example of the use of autumn leaves in this way in the poem on Tanabata I mentioned earlier, but here's another which uses the same imagery. Tatsutaga wa momiji midarete nagaru meri, wataraba nishiki nakaya tae namu. Along the Tatsuta River, the scarlet leaves in such confusion drift that, were I to ford across, this brocade would be split in two, I'd say. Also associated with trees in autumn was ivy, tsuta, with poems often composed which compared the difference between its leaves, which changed colour with the season, and those of evergreens, which did not, as in Iro kaenu, matsu no midori ni hao tsuta wa ono ga momiji o yuzuru narikeri. The unchanging hue of the pine tree's green, trailing ivy, its own scarlet leaves it has surrendered. Also associated with autumn, although not as exclusively, was suzuki, silvergrass, which grew, and indeed still does grow, extensively in Japan, and can reach heights of between 2 and 4 metres tall if left undisturbed. The primary autumn association of this grass was of the rustling sound its fronds made as the wind blew across them, linking the plant with the seasonal weather, as in Hana suzuki, kusamo no tamoto no tsuyu chirite, tedama mo yura ni akikaze zo fuku. O silvergrass, upon your shoots cuffs, dew has fallen, bejewelled fingers rustling in the gusts of autumn wind. A further plant with strong autumn associations was bush clover, huggy, which is a shrubby plant related to the pea family. This plant was conventionally linked in autumn waka with deer, and in particular stags. Autumn was the animals' mating season, and so it was common to hear them belling from the mountains and forests. Indeed, there's a subset of autumn deer poems about how the animals' calls disrupt the poet's solitude. In other waka, though, the mate the stags were seeking was the bush clover, with the plant playing the female role to the animal's male, as in Saoshika no shigarami fusuru aki hagi wa tamanasu tsuyu zo tsutsumi tarikeru. Ah, the stag, entangled, tripped on the autumn bush clover. Dewdrops turned gemlets have wrapped him all around. Other animals used in autumn poetry were primarily insects, either generically or specific types. The poetic focus was not on the creature's appearance or behaviour, but on the sounds they made, chirps and other sounds. These sounds were felt to be filled with pathos, as autumn was the season when the insects would die off, and so almost any reference to an insect in an autumn poem is tinged with melancholy and the unspoken knowledge that the creature does not have long to live. This link was aided by the fact that the verb for sing, cry like an insect or bird, naku, was homophonous with the verb meaning weep, and this dual meaning was a standard feature of waka about autumn insects or birds. Excuse me. For example, higurashi no naku aki yama o koe kureba koto zo tomo naku mono zo kanashiki. The sundown cicadas sing in the autumn mountains, passing by. Everything is somehow all the more sad. The bird most strongly associated with autumn was the goose, as this was the season when the migrating birds flew south to spend their winters in warmer climes. The arrival back home of the geese, therefore, was one of the principal natural markers of the change of season, and so was frequently the topic of waka. Indeed, the simple mention of geese in a poem would generally be enough to mark it out as an autumn one, even if there weren't any other seasonal references. The wordplay of naku to mean both sing, cry out, and weep was especially productive in goose poems, because a folk belief held that the birds wept tears of blood as they flew over, and these were one of the reasons for the changing colours of the autumn leaves. Nobe somuru kare no namida wa iro mo nashi, mono omou tsuyu no oki no sato ni wa. The field-staining goose tears lack all colour, in the dew of melancholy thoughts falling on my dwelling here on Oki Isle. Gotoba evokes the melancholy of autumn in this poem with his reference to the goose tears as well as dew. His poem is cleverly constructed in that the falling, Oki, of the dew is homophonous with the place name Oki, referring to the islands to which he had been exiled after an unsuccessful attempt to rebel against the samurai government, which controlled the country. Geese wept tears of blood, but people were supposed to do so too, when in the depths of grief, and so there's an echo in the poem that it is him weeping at his permanent separation from his home in the capital. A further bird associated with autumn was the quail. These birds were one of the prey which the nobility hunted with hawks, but in Waka, even those which addressed the topic of hunting, the focus was on the birds' cries, which were felt to be melancholy and thus in keeping with the season of autumn. Akikaze o itoi yasuran, yu magure asaji ga shita ni uzura naku nari. The autumn wind, do they dislike it, I wonder? In the dark of evening, from beneath the sparse stalks of kogon grass, the quails are crying. I hope you found this quick trip through Waka's autumn useful. More seasons to come.